As we continue, you will come to know Dr. von Franz more and more. I would like to introduce her by quoting one of her pithy remarks. Too many people use the tit of compassion when they should use the sword of discretion. She does say it like it is. I remember talking to her after she did the film. I had been to the opening in Boston, and we had difficulty there because too many people, guests in the hotel, the waiters, and others were coming in and just slipping through and were fascinated by the film, so there wasn't room for our own audience. And she laughed and laughed, and she said, "That makes me very happy. I like to think that this film will go out to people who are not aware of their dreams and do not understand the unconscious." I am honored to introduce this woman, to have you share her wisdom, her sense of humor, and her profound humanness. I am honored to bring The Way of the Dream with Marie-Louise von Franz. I am also honored to introduce the director-producer of the film, Fraser Boa. For 3 years, he labored to bring the dream to reality with patience, with discretion, with commitment. He gradually brought the images to life. I am honored to introduce you to my brother.
Dreams have been called the royal road to the unconscious. We'll be traveling down that royal road, but first we're going to look at a map. C.G. Jung discovered that in the apparent chaos of dreams, there are recurring figures and motifs which he documented and named. These landmarks are easily recognizable, and they act as reference points in dream interpretation. Once seen, then dreams begin to make some sense. But there's nothing to interpret if you haven't got a dream.
Well, I don't have too much experience with with dreams, but I guess some people do.
Did you ever have a dream that you thought was important?
If I did, it was forgotten right away. Yeah.
The main thing I remember about them is I can't really remember them, unfortunately.
Can't recall any that I've had lately.
In the moment, I can't tell you any dream. I don't remember it in the moment.
Every night, would you tell us a dream? Do you recall them? Do you remember your dreams?
No, I don't, sir. I quickly forget.
Dr. von Franz, why is it that people can't recall their dreams?
I think it's because they don't pay attention. Some people have come to me laughingly and said, "You analyze people with their dreams, don't you?" Well, you can't with me because I never dream. And I've just grinned and said, "Okay, let's see." They always dreamt. It was just that they didn't pay attention. But the next night they go to bed and they think, "Wonder if I dream or if I don't dream." And already that question probably tickles out a dream, and the dream appears. So in fact, I have never met anybody who didn't dream, except you can say that in very, very heavy state of depression, people have what I call dream constipation. They don't dream much sometimes, and they always feel better. As soon as they begin to dream, they are better. And sometimes in very old people, over 80, the dreams get fewer, very few dream. And then come up again frequently shortly before death. Then generally there's a period where people dream again.
Well, now, I'll tell you, I don't have very good memory. Now, I'm pretty near 90 years old.
Are you really?
And I just can't, I know I used to dream a lot, but I don't dream anymore.
Do you remember any of the dreams you used to have?
Well, not this moment, but maybe after I get walking away, I'll think of them.
What happens when people don't remember their dreams? What happens to the energies? What happens to the feelings that aren't expressed and the potentials that aren't realized?
That they are the sources of what we call neurosis, neurotic symptoms. The most general neurotic symptom is restlessness. That isn't yet looked at in modern times because everybody is so restless. It isn't looked at to be a neurosis, to be restless, but it is actually. Primitive man or the Hindu or the Chinese criticize the white race very much for being constantly restless. And you can see that those are those energies which, because we are not connected with the dream world, with the unconscious, we have a surplus of bottled up energy which makes us fuss around all the time. Or it can take the form of a kind of all-pervading anxiety, a fear that somewhere something dark is luring and might happen any minute, and then one is anxious about nothing all the time. That is also an unawareness that there is bottled up energy in the unconscious, which we do not tap and which we do not integrate in consciousness. Irritability, aggressiveness, over-sexiness, or a feeling of complete meaningless emptiness, all the different symptoms of different neurotic diseases come from that. So we can say if you are not connected properly with your own dream life, then you are liable to develop some kind of neurotic behavior.
In everyday speech, we often say that a person has a complex, power complex, inferiority complex, mother complex. Would you explain the psychological meaning of the word complex?
Well, a complex is simply the motor of the psyche. They are like different nuclear centers which give the drive and the impulse and the aliveness to the psyche. If we had no complex, we would be complexes, we would be dead. You see that at once. For instance, you are somewhere and you are terribly bored, and then something touches your complex, and you go and you get going. Your interest is aroused. That is because the complex has been touched. So the complex are simply the energy centers of the psyche. But we generally, in colloquial language, use it only in its negative form. We say somebody has a sex complex or a money complex or a mother complex, and then it means that this special theme arouses the person negatively.
We filmed the dream of a young woman in which the complex is personified by the father. All the energies of the dream focus around this father figure, and she eventually finds him sitting at the wheel of a car, apparently dead.
I went out and I noticed in the porch my father's car was still there, and he was at the wheel, motionless, bent forward as if about to drive, but not moving. And I realized then that he may be dead, and I should call an ambulance. But I looked around the driveway. There was a circular driveway. The driveway was filled with balloons, hundreds and hundreds of white balloons. And the thought came to me then that before an ambulance could get to him, every one of those balloons had to be burst.
We've said that dreams reveal the unconscious of an individual. What do you mean by the term unconscious?
All that which we know is psychically real but is not conscious. It's a borderline concept. It's not conscious. It's a negative concept. We use that negative concept in order to not have a prejudice, because some people call it supra-consciousness, and others would call it the divine sphere, and others would call it the existential ground of existence, or you can have 1,000 names. We prefer the word unconscious because it says nothing. It says only it is not conscious, and it leaves it as a mystery. We don't know what it is. We only know that there are psychic phenomena which manifest through dreams or through involuntary gestures or speech mistakes or hallucinations or fantasies, and which are not conscious. You can, for instance, be befallen in daytime by a fantasy and tell it to your analyst and say it's a completely weird fantasy, it's crazy, I don't know what it means. So, as you don't know what it means and you think it's crazy, it's obviously not conscious. Because if it were conscious, you would know what it means. And you would know to what it refers to. But it has come. Now, it is psychic. It has not happened materially. It has happened as a psychic event. And that's why we call the sum of all psychic events which are not conscious the unconscious.
But many people don't realize that dreams reveal the unconscious. That every element of a dream represents some aspect of their own personality. If, for example, a person dreams about wrestling with a dark stranger, what's difficult to understand is that the dark stranger represents some aspect of themselves that they're wrestling with. Let's look now at what Jung called the shadow.
When I was younger, I used to sort of get dreams about when people were chasing me, and I'd be running along, and I couldn't run fast. I was as if I was being pulled back, and you know, these people were getting nearer, and it was really frightening.
One typical nightmare is that one is pursued by some terrible or demonic or unknown power, and one runs and runs for one's life, and knowing all the time in the dream that finally they will get one. And you hide, and you can't hide, and they will see you, and you look for another hiding place, and they will discover you again, and you run and run. Persecution always means something wants to come to us. The only way to meet a persecuting demon is to turn around and to say, here I am, what do you want from me? Then the nightmarish pursuer generally changes face. It simply represents that we have turned away from some part of our psyche, and therefore it runs after us, it wants to get at us, literally. But we don't want it. The unconscious shows us the face we show it. If we reject something within us, then it becomes destructive to us. And if we don't reject it, that's what I mean by saying turning around and saying in a friendly manner, what do you want? Then you suddenly see that it isn't so bad. Then you have a chance that whatever pursues one shows a more amenable face, and that one can make some pact with it or some arrangement.
Yes, I had a particular one as a child where I dreamed I was in a room full of people who got up and said good night and left me alone, and then I waited for it, some frightful spectre came in through the door, and I had that dream 3 times running.
There was a little tiny window, and in there was the wild woman, and she'd been there since 1928, and she was so wild that she couldn't keep still at all. Her arms and legs kept moving, and her hair was everywhere. You couldn't see her face at all. Somebody else went over to her to talk to her, and she put a knife to their throat.
I had a bad dream about somebody who was vicious to me, or was going to attack me in my dream, and somebody I knew, and I met him on the street and I wanted to punch him in the mouth.
The shadow is the name we generally use for persons of the same sex appearing in dreams, which very often have a slight inferior quality or opposite quality to the ego of the dreamer. The shadow can be our inferior side, our best enemy, so to speak, but can also just be our other side. A beautiful couple of ego and his shadow are, for instance, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. The one being completely crazy and unrealistic, and the other being a body man, down to earth. They can't live without each other. Sancho is not evil and Don Quixote is not only good, but they are a typical example of the ego and its shadow in 1,000 forms.
We film quite a humorous example of the interplay between the shadow and the ego. In the dream, the shadow takes the form of a popular rock star who quite literally hooks the dreamer.
In this dream, I'm going to a David Bowie concert, and I've decided I want to meet this man, David Bowie. And I come into this large, like, circus tent that's lit with many different colored lights. And I have a sense of being in sort of a tale of the Arabian Nights. The show begins, and he comes out and begins to sing a song of his, which is called Move On, Move On. And throughout this dream, there's this sort of repetitive theme of move on, move on. And come intermission time, the stage is emptied, and a crane comes out, and a hook comes down and grabs me, pulls me up, brings me over the stage, and drops me onto the stage. And I just feel myself falling and falling and falling, and I realize that I've messed this thing up. And I wake in an incredible panic, realizing that I've missed an opportunity. I've missed a chance for something.
Let's leave the shadow now and move on to other figures of the unconscious. The women in the dreams of men and the men in the dreams of women. Jung says that, psychologically speaking, every man has an inner woman and every woman has an inner man. Many people find that a difficult concept to understand.
Well, we well know that we are born from genes, and that only the predominance of male or female genes make the gender of a child. And there are even androgynous creatures sometimes where even nature can't make up quite their mind what to produce, a man or a woman. And even every man has breasts and nipples on the breasts, and, so to speak, a sketched feminine side, and the woman has a clitoris and a sketched masculine side, and the same is true for the psyche. Not only our body is predominantly male or female, but having the other element in it, our psyche too is predominantly male or female, but contains the other side.
And isn't it interesting how the feminine side of a man's personality in his dreams takes just as many forms as there are women in real life?
I think that most of us, when we dream, we think of women.
At that moment in time, I believe I started to stroke her, and I inserted my hand into the lower part of her bikini, and I was fondling her and stroking her. And suddenly she said, "I don't want your hand." She said, "I want your penis. I want you to make love to me." And I said, "Oh no, if I did that, then if I entered it, I would be afraid that then she would change completely into a fully fledged vampire, blood-sucking vampire, and I would be lost."
Well, I have dreams about Greta Garbo, who I was mad about for a long time.
I was standing at the top of a huge staircase, and it was a well staircase, and it sort of wound round down. You could see it descending. It was quite high up. And there were lots of people screaming and rushing about in agitation, because slowly up the stairs was coming this dead 15-year-old girl.
Men have always created an idealized form of a woman. Marilyn Monroe, for example, was worshipped like a goddess. Is there an equivalent masculine figure, an idealized masculine figure?
What Marilyn Monroe has been to men, Valentino has been to women. He represents, so to speak, the ideal demon lover, where women are carried away into a romantic ecstasy and fantasize to be like the chic in more modern films, to be carried away by the demon lover into a romantic us two aloneness.
And then I was followed by a tall blonde man who wrapped me up in his cloak and took me to his gypsy caravan.
I've even dreamt I was dancing with Humphrey Bogart when he hadn't got a stitch on. How about that?
Generally, especially if the women are such women who are unhappy in their relationship to their husband or to their lover, the fantasy, therefore, of being carried away and having a secret nocturnal love affair with animus and anima. Animus and anima are therefore very ambiguous, very dangerous inner figures which have to be approached with great wisdom. They are the great mischief makers between men and women.
We talked about figures of the same sex as the dreamer and figures of the opposite sex. Let's look now at the figure which Jung described as the center of the psyche, the self.
In most religious systems, you have an allusion to a kind of divine center from which everything, all order and all organization stems. And if we can find out where dreams come, we can say from that center, whatever that center is. That center appears in the dreams itself, sometimes as a center, as a mandala, as an inner city, as a circle or a square, or some other abstract formation, or it appears as a divine savior child, as a savior figure, as a wise old man or wise old woman figure personified, something, a psychopomp, something which guides our psychic life. All these figures seem to point to that ultimately unknown and unknowable greater center in our psyche. Nowadays we speak very much of self-realization, and there's always the danger of mixing this up with what Jung meant by this, the self. For Jung, the self, written with a capital, is meant to be that supraordinate inner divine center, unknown divine center of the psyche, which we have to explore all our lifetime. Nobody knows what the self in him is and wants from him. We need the dreams. We can say the dreams are the letters of the self, which the self writes us every night, telling us, do a bit more of that, or do a bit less of that, or go ahead to the left, or go ahead to the right. And as I say, if one looks back, one sees suddenly there is a pattern in this, as if the self with a capital is having a plan with us, a kind of destiny. While what in general psychological literature is meant by self-realization is more building up a strong ego consciousness. That is also something important, especially in the first half of life, but it's nothing to do with the adventure of encountering the self within one. That is not self-realization in the ordinary sense of the word. It's an adventurous encounter with a greater inner center within oneself.
Would you say more about the pattern of dreams? Is there an overall pattern which unfolds over a person's lifetime?
In the first half of life, it's directed more towards an outgoing adaptation to earthly and material outer life, and in the second half of life it generally begins to steer the individual more towards withdrawal and to develop a certain wisdom and a certain insight into the background of life. And the last dreams of dying people are a clear preparation for death. Ultimately, we don't know where we come from psychologically speaking, and we don't know where we go. We are part of that cosmic mystery which is the existence of nature and all things. We don't know why there are galaxies and stars, we don't know why there is a universe. And we only begin to realize that there are certain master patterns, and it looks as if our psychological inner life is also organized by a master pattern. It's centered somewhere. There is a directing force. It's not a chaotic, random thing or phenomenon. And when people get very old, they have therefore an inclination to go through their lives and muse again over their big events in life and their dreams. And if one does that carefully, one generally sees a certain pattern in it. Problems which solve themselves, which pose themselves, solve themselves, switch over into new problems. There seems to be a secret organization. And the center of that organization is what the mystics would call the divine spark in the psyche, or the God image in the human psyche. The Western mystics, the Buddhists would call it the Buddha mind in us.
Jung dreamt of the self in the form of the yogi. You remember he was walking down the road and came to the little chapel? There were no crucifixes or statues, just the flower arrangement. And Jung saw the yogi sitting in front of the altar. The yogi was in a state of deep meditation.
Jung realized with a shock that this was the yogin who was imagining him, and that in the trance he was in a kind of active imagination, imagining the life of Jung, dreaming him, and that when the yogin would wake up, he, Jung, would no longer exist. He was, the ordinary Professor Jung, was the dream of that greater inner figure.
That reminds me of the dream of Chang Tzu.
He dreamt that he was a butterfly, and now he's puzzling all the time. Is he a man who dreamt that he was a butterfly, or is he a butterfly who dreamt that he was a man? That is very true. We cannot figure that out. A butterfly is a symbol of the soul. Are we the dream of the self, or is the self our dream? We don't know.